Right, and so y'all can see my screen. All right. Okay, awesome. So just a quick couple things with our agenda. So just wanted to mention kind of what we're going to be talking about today. You know, as I have this, it's a good problem to have, but every time I prepare for any kind of CEU or presentation, I always run into this desire to include so much, and but we only have so much time. And so I always say this at the beginning: we're going to scratch the surface for these trainings because it's so hard to put everything into it. And so, but these are the areas I definitely wanted to touch on. So I want to talk about. We all probably know a lot about adoption, but I want to talk about the understanding conceptualization of adoption, trauma, and grief. And so I want to be able to talk to that. We'll go over those 7 core issues that we see with adoption. We'll talk about what humanistic sand trade therapy is and how we can utilize, like, what's the rationale in even using sand trade therapy, and then be able to understand how we could incorporate that with the adoption triad. And then we'll also, towards the end, talk about some basic supplies. Like if you're interested in growing and having, incorporating sanctuary in your office, kind of what to expect and what are the supplies look like? What does the set, what entails, what's the setup going to look like? So we'll talk a little bit about that. And then we'll have hopefully just enough time for some Q&A. All right. So, how can we make the best of this training? Just this is a moment to ground yourself. We had, gosh, such a phenomenal keynote this morning, and I feel like I'm still absorbing all of that. So, hopefully, you got a chance to absorb all of that as well. But taking a moment to go ahead and silence your phones, do what you need to kind of settle into your space. If you need to close out some tabs, if you need to get some water, a drink, coffee, just anything that can help ground you to go ahead and set your intention as we continue. So, just a little bit about me. Thank you so much, Stacey, earlier for the introduction. I'm based out of Allen. I started working in the area of adoption several years ago, and it was just what drew me to it was I do a lot of work with children and attachment and work with caregivers, so parents and children. And one thing that really drew me was how in adoption or in the adoption triad, that parent child relationship, whether it's the biological parent and child relationship, whether it's the adoptive parent relationship, or whether it's the adoptee who has children and their relationship. And I was just really fascinated by the work in the adoption world, but also really troubled by the dark history that America has related to adoption and adoption practices. And so it opened my eyes to a world that I wasn't aware of. And the more I learned about it, the more disturbing it was. But it was also then inspiring to be able to help, whether it's adoptees, whether it's adopting parents, or the biological parents, to be able to make meaning from whatever their experience has been in this journey. And so that's kind of how it started. And then I went on to get advanced training with the Case Institute. If you've heard of it, it's the Center for Adoption Support and Education, and they have a really great TAC program, which is a competency program, to become adoption competent as therapists. And so I went through that. It's a pretty intensive, long training that's drawn out over several weeks. So I was able to take that, and there's like an exam that I still need to take for that to wrap it up. But anyways, so there's all this training that I did, and that continued to help me grow in this area. And it's one of the favorite parts of my work in my practice is to work with this piece of adoption. Real quick, these are just some of the services that we offer at our practice, and the ones that you see highlighted are kind of the areas that I specialize in. So I certainly would like to know who we have in the room today. And so if you want to just post in the chat, kind of like where you're from, what state you practice in, are you in private practice, what your role is, and also a little bit about kind of are you practicing Santry right now? Are you interested in Santry? Is this something you've heard of that you're wanting to explore? I'm really curious. So if you want to just plug that into the chat, that would be great. And then I'll take a look here at what's coming up in the chat as well. Bring my window here. Okay, so all right. Oh wow, Brooke, I didn't know you were licensed in all these states. That's great. Awesome. Welcome, Darcy. You're at the Boston Post Adoption Resources. Oh, I've gotten some resources from BPAR, which have been excellent. Oh wow, we have a fellow Addison, Texas therapist here. That's awesome. Anne Marie, best therapist. Oh, yes, awesome. Jerry, you're from Michigan. Awesome. Maternal mental health and play therapy, and you're also an adoptee and an adopter. That's great. I'm so glad to hear. I also specialize in perinatal mental health, and so good to know that you are also drawn to that. Yeah, maybe we have Anne Marie. We very, very possible that we may have run into each other. Um, but yeah, oh gosh, thank you. Thank you all for being here and thank you for sharing. It's always great to hear um, who's who's attending, so I can also tailor some of what I talk about. Awesome. Okay. Oh, just forgot to put this in here. I have a podcast for therapists. If it's something I recently started, just another means to be able to share information out there. And so this is another medium of that. So if you're interested, if you're a podcast listener, you could find this on any of the podcast platforms. So feel free to check that out. It's a relatively new venture. Um, and then I have some free resources for therapists as well. There's a couple of courses that are on demand and free. I just hope that as many therapists as possible can have some of the fundamental training on like what is trauma and domestic violence and how to understand or conceptualize that in the clients that you work with. So if you have any therapists, students, associates, or interns that could benefit, please encourage them to enroll in any of those free courses. They're great. They're just an hour long and really, really, I think, helpful in understanding some of the basics. All right, so let's go ahead and start talking about adoption. And I know we know a lot about adoption, but I want to help us understand a little bit more in depth in terms of the mental health clinical piece here. So we talked about this a lot in the keynote as well, but like when we think about how our society and our community sees adoption, just again in the chat, if you want to share what in your community do you see, or in society do you notice how people view adoption? Like adoption is blank. How does what purpose, right, does adoption serve in our communities, or what is the perception of adoption? Adoption is love. Okay. A win-win-win. Adoption is a solution. Yeah, yeah. I think adoption is often, yeah, like a second choice. Yeah. Adoption, over time, when in the gamut of all the things I've heard, one of the things I've heard is that adoption is beautiful, or it's lovely and it's just so generous. That's kind of how it's perceived, with the adoption families or the families who are choosing adoption. It's seen as that too. And I think in these various different narratives, like we were even talking about this morning in the keynote, various different narratives, I think we need to remind ourselves and have these conversations in the community, that adoption, we see it as this positive, hopeful solution. We see it as this solution to a significant problem, a permanent placement for a child, right? Like it's a solution to something that is a problem. But really, sorry, whoops. But really, what adoption is loss, right? There is loss. There is disruption with an attachment figure. And when we see it just as this positive, hopeful solution or like a placement, a solution to a significant problem, we kind of miss understanding or conceptualizing this in terms of this adoption. There's loss and an attachment disruption in adoption, and we don't see it quite like that, right? So we want, and it almost sounds like like a very negative way of seeing it, but it's a very real way of understanding what that truly is, because then that leads to all these other narratives, right, that we talked about this morning that are not helpful or healthy. So I won't go into too much detail about kind of the types of adoption. We know this, the different open, closed, kinship, transitional, and international, and domestic. I do want to, spend a couple minutes on this adoption triad. Again, when we think about adoption, we think of, and it's probably because we think about just the one client person that we're working with, right? But we have to understand, so if we're working with the adoptee, we have to conceptualize the adoptee, keeping in mind the birth family, the adoptive family, and the adoptee. Either of these don't exist in a silo, right? They don't exist in isolation, and we have to be able to conceptualize them, keeping all three of these in mind. So when we think about adoption and the experience, right? How or where, at what point, right, does this become traumatic? Because we have to first understand what leads to adoption, right? Some sort of loss, some sort of adversity, some sort of abuse or neglect that we're trying to find safety, perhaps, for the child, right? Or there's just some adversity where there is this child is unable to stay with the birth family and needs a new home or a new set of caregivers, right? Or there's loss, right? One or both parents. And the loss could be loss due to death, loss due to incarceration, loss due to many, other possibilities. And so understanding that some form of adversity is what leads to adoption. So it begins with an attachment disruption. There's an attachment figure, and the child is the relationship, that attachment is disrupted. The loss of a child's primordial, loving, caring, and protective relationship can indelibly imprinted on the unconscious mind as a traumatic injury. As much as there's this narrative around, oh, if you were adopted at birth, right, then there's less harm done, or there's this. Again, I think it's glamorized where, oh, there's less issues here. But then I think, again, that shadows all the different things that could be happening or could occur in the future that we aren't paying attention to because of this narrative that this is, it's much better taking this route, right? But again, that attachment figure, that disruption certainly impacts and creates this traumatic injury. And we can't deny that. So just a little bit about attachment theory, attachment disruptions. We know from a lot of research, after birth, the child's initial experiences with the caregiver have a profound impact on them. That baby-parent interaction teaches the babies a lot about how to regulate, right? Like that give and receive. Those daily interactions are very soothing, right? We know how the mother's, scent, their feel, their body, their voice. There's so much that goes into this, right? That is disrupted. And so moving into now, let's talk a little bit about sand trade therapy and attachment, right? There's a shared, like a common denominator here, which I think is beautiful in this work, is because there is this emphasis on the relationship between the caretaker and the creation, right? And so this is a really important parallel as we do this work in Santry, that you'll see the caretaker, the one who created, right, the creation, the Santry, and then our relationship with our client and the tray, right? So let's talk about attachment sensitive therapy. Now, it's sand trade therapy is a form of attachment sensitive therapy. And why or how does that become attachment sensitive? So because attachment sensitive therapy includes assisting a client to become aware of thoughts, feelings, behaviors that are connected to a caregiving experience that are often out of their awareness, right? And it helps clients make meaning of that experience of not having that caregiver. Therapist's primary role here is to provide the patient, or the client in this case, a secure base, right? We know that there is healing in safety, right? In that felt safety in a relationship is where we know there is healing, right? And Balby, who has done a ton of research, right, and work in this area, believe that therapy works when clients feel safe to explore their inner worlds, and that's what Sandtray really helps our clients do. So when we think about attachment theory, some of the key concepts: secure base, safe haven, and that narrative coherence, right? Having that secure base is essentially the therapist consistently present, attuned, and allowing the client to work at their own pace. A safe haven. So when clients are experiencing and exploring inner pain, or sadness and grief, or absence, right, of people in their lives, there needs to be a space that they can work with another human, that therapist, to be able to hold that, right? So there has to be a place where you can experience that, the heaviness of that, right? And then the narrative coherence, where a lot of times we've talked about this in the keynote too, right? Where the narrative, it changes the way you see yourself. The sense of self, who I am, my identity, becomes very, kind of think of a puzzle where all the pieces are spread, right? It's very dismantled. And how can we bring that into a coherent sense of your own narrative? And that's what Sandtray can help us do, is over multiple sessions through Sandtray, we can help our clients develop that coherence into of their narrative. Some more components of attachment sensitive therapy that will align with Sandtray therapy is there's this arousal. There's this arousal in the sense, that dissonance that's happening, right? That's coming up in the Sandtray. Then there's proximity. How close am I? So there's I'm jumping ahead of myself, but in the Sandtray therapy work, we talk about being close, not like on the other end of the room while our client is building their Sandtray. So there's proximity, there's tolerance of silence, moments where the client is quietly building their Sandtray. And then lead taking on how we're going to process this Sandtray, right? And play, and we'll talk about this too, but Sandtray essentially is a form of play therapy. And so like with the younger children, we'll do play therapy, and with the older kids and teens and adults, we'll do Sandtray therapy. So we know that the majority of the brain growth occurs in the first, few years of your life. And so when we think about implicit memories, and that's a big part of what Sandtray therapy really helps, is because there's no words to these implicit memories, right? It's pre-verbal. These wounds, it's very hard to articulate these. And so Sandtray, play therapy, Sandtray therapy, these experiential modes of therapy allow us to go to those places to be able to process those implicit memories that really don't have any words, right? And children, or even adults, we store a lot of that in our bodies, right? And the implicit memories are stored in the limbic brain, right? In the frontal cortex. And a lot of times we operate from that frontal cortex. So this is a great graphic that I found at the BPAR, which is just a great, you could find this on their website as well, but it's just a really great um, way to understand trauma that occurs in the adoption journey and the different stages, right? In early life, what that looks like, how that looks, or kind of the implications it has relationally, culturally, and then with society. So this, I wanted to put this up there to give you a little bit of a visual of how many layers of trauma that anyone from the adoption triad could be experiencing. Excuse me. Acknowledging adoption as traumatic is a critical component of healing, because again, if we don't do that, if we don't conceptualize it like that, we will miss a whole lot in our clients when we're working with them. So we've got to be able to conceptualize this from that place. And we know that early life trauma can lead to attachment difficulties, right? It changes the way we view relationships. It changes the way we relate to people. It changes the way we form attachments, right? And so this is really important information for us to know as therapists and as providers, right? What is my client's worldview like with relationships? So let's talk about the 7 core issues of adoption. The reason this is important is because in our work, whether it's traditional like your talk therapy or even sand tray therapy, these themes can emerge. And I want to talk about them from each perspective, from the birth family perspective, the adoptee perspective, and then the adopting parent or family's perspective, right? Because we want to understand that these 7 core issues are running through all 3 in that triad, right? And we can't ignore it. And it ebbs and flows. You may not see these all at once, right? You're going to see them ebb and flow, but it's important to understand that these themes exist and we want to look for them. So at the very, very center of adoption, right, we talked about there's loss. And what this loss can look like with the adoptive parent is they may have experienced infertility or loss of a child. The birth parents essentially now don't have access to the child that they once were biologically connected to. And the adoptees experience this loss of being separated from their birth family. And not just their birth family, all that comes with that, whether that's the cultural identity, whether that's the extended family, whether that's, right, there's all these things that are facets, right, that are part of that identity that they're now being or having been separated from, right? So we want to understand at the very, very core of this is loss, okay? And then, so let's understand the different kinds of loss that adoptive birth and adoptive adoptees can experience, right? So we talked about adoptive parents, the infertility, the loss of the birth experience of, with a child, loss of that genetic connection, right? Not knowing the child's complete history, if they're, depending on the access they had or the information that they had. There's also this grief that I see in not being able to protect their the adoptee from some of the sadness or grief the adoptee will experience from whether it's search and reunion or even before search and reunion starts just even the experience of or knowing some of the awareness that the adoptee has and not being able to almost protect or mitigate some of that. That's very difficult for the adopting parents as well. For birth parents, loss just of the child. Again, when we think about adoption, we don't think about the birth parents as much. I feel like that's often an element that's kind of removed. So we want to keep that in mind, not knowing how the child is growing up there, what kind of pain the birth parent is experiencing. So what kind of loss in terms of the loss of the child itself, but loss of knowing the milestones, connection, right? Especially when it's a closed adoption. And then for adoptive parents, the adoptee, the loss of the birth family, any kind of connections to a previous family, What are their ethnic, religious, racial, cultural, language, like all of loss of that, especially with transracial adoptees. Um, and then depending on what age they were when they were adopted, they had to leave behind, right, when they were adopted, any kind of associations. And it's this, the ability to be able to make meaning, right, of what's happened so far, what's going to happen, what I'm experiencing right now, right? There's a lot of confusion. And as awareness grows, so with awareness, there is grief and there is sadness. We can't have awareness without that. Like as we continue to become aware of things, we also grieve certain things, right? And then there's rejection. What that looks like for adoptive parents, sometimes they'll feel rejection by the child, rejection by the birth family, maybe by their own family members, by the child. For birth parents, that could look like rejection associated with just the circumstances of having to take this route. And then for the adoptee, the experience or the perception of being rejected by birth parents, or siblings, um, by peers, also, and then the narrative of I must have done something wrong. There's something about me that led to this adoption, that my birth parents didn't want to continue to keep me with them, right? Like that self blame for that rejection, and then um, shame and guilt. Adoptive parents can feel this where there's this guilt of parenting someone else's child, or guilt over frustration or anger at the child's behavior. We talked about this earlier, where we start this journey with some expectations, and then some very different things start to unfold, and then we feel guilt over feeling like this is not what I signed up for, or this is not what I expected. And a lot of times when we work with these parents, it can be very triggering to hear the frustration. But what I will always, tell, like, whether it's clients or even my interns or associates, is that we have to really validate, this human experience of confusion or frustration or anger, that adoptive parents are feeling as well, right? Because there's a lot underneath that, and we want to be able to help them process that in a very non-judgmental way, because there's a lot of judgment out there, for anyone in the adoption triad. For birth parents, there's shame over the circumstances, and the choices that are being made. And then for the adoptee, there's, again, based on that self blame that comes, there's this guilt, right, of like, oh, maybe I just wasn't good enough, or the guilt and fear of wanting to, that search and reunion, desire for search and reunion, like is it, I feel guilty asking my adoptive parents for information, or wanting to do this, or choosing to search and reunite or reach out, right? So there's this dissonance, this push and pull. And I recall, like, just over the years, I've had the gamut from, some clients who just have this, very much like, oh no, I'm okay. There's nothing, everything's fine. I don't even think about my adoption. I don't even think about my birth family. I'm okay where I am. And I, like the keynote speaker mentioned earlier, that's often a very strong coping mechanism. Like, I need to keep up with that narrative because I feel safe with that narrative. And I feel like I'm not rocking any boat here, because if I rock the boat, right, that work is really difficult, and I don't know if I'm ready to do that right now, so I'm just going to continue this narrative, this status quo, because it feels safer. And I come from this very person-centered place, and so I truly believe that our clients are, whatever they're doing, there's purpose behind it, and they know where they need to go in therapy. And so allowing them to show us and to lead us in that direction, it tells me a lot about my client, like where my client's at. And it's very important for me to follow their lead, because they know where they need to go, how quickly or slowly they need to inch into this direction. And so if they're choosing to talk about it in this way, I work with that. We work with how that feels for them, right? How that doesn't, they don't feel anything. And we kind of like that stages of change, right? Like that's, they're in this very pre-contemplation place where like, I don't see an issue with this and I'm fine with it. And we genuinely work with that. And so, so sometimes we'll see some of that guilt and shame come through this way, like it's in a very indirect way. Identity, we talked a lot about this in the previous question, right? Like figuring out your identity. Who am I? Where did I come from as an adoptee? The issue, the theories and the models of that identity formation. And then for birth parents, am I like allowed to even feel sadness because I made a choice, right? Am I still considered the parent? Am I still, is it okay for me to still be a part of their life? Right? Or am I just a bad person for the choices that I made? Can I be a mom? Can I choose to have another child? Right? Like there's all these issues or questions that come up in terms of the identity that a birth parent has. And then for the adoptive parents, identity as a parent, like, am I really a parent if I'm adopting a child? Like, what does that mean? And a lot of times these narratives are beliefs or core beliefs that have been cultivated over time. And so when we see these core beliefs or these kinds of identity like conflicts, we want to really spend some time addressing them to see what exactly that means to our clients. Okay, intimacy, we've got a couple more of these. I'm going to run through these a little faster so I can get to the other parts. But intimacy, this is where we're understanding relationally how we're showing up, right? Whether for the adoptive parents, like what does that mean relationally showing up with their adoptive child? What are some of those struggles? Um, Birth parents, like what does that feel like to not have that connection, right? That intimacy, that feeling of like, can I, like I'd like to have that closeness, but I'm scared, I'm ashamed, I feel guilty, right? So that relational piece is really missing, or there's confusion around that intimacy, that relational piece. And then for the adoptee as well, not just the relationship with the birth family or the adoptive family, but their own relationships that they form over the years, right? How do they conceptualize and understand the way they relate to other humans, other relationships, friendships, intimate partners, right? Like, what does that feel like for them and how that comes up for them in their lives? And then mastery and control, where I feel like I have a handle on things. I feel like so as an adoptive parent, there may have been themes or moments or times where they felt like things were happening that were beyond their control. So then how have they restored that control in their lives? What have they done, or what work have they done in restoring that, right? Same for birth parents, lack of control over the inability to parent their own child. Lack of, there's a lot of, again, with the dark history that America has with adoption, how much control did birth parents have in this process? We certainly know the adoptee didn't have that kind of control. We know that. But what control did the birth parents have in this decision, or in the decisions they had to make now or several years ago, right? And of course, for the adoptee, what kind of control did they have in this whole process, right? Of separation, of placements, all of that. Like, who gets? If we ask who gets to decide, it's definitely not the adoptee who's making these decisions, right? They're having to roll with decisions that are being made for them. So I want you to take a few minutes here, and we'll have you separate into small groups, but I want you to take a few minutes and think about a client that you've seen in the past, from any of the, anyone from that triad. And what theme of adoption can you recall? I just want you to kind of keep that in mind a little bit. Like, what theme did I recall seeing in my client or even current client, from this adoption triad around those themes, issues of adoption? And how does these themes, understanding these themes, change the way you conceptualize those clients? So I think Stacy's going to have you all. Let me just see here. Yeah, so Stacy will have you move into groups, and we'll take about, I want to say, 7 to 10 minutes to discuss that, and then we'll come back in here and talk about that as well.
Definitely. Hold on, ladies. We're gonna make the quick switch. Okay. And you want to do what? 3 rooms? Hannah, it's like 9 people online.
Sounds good. Mhm.
Okay, perfect. Hold on, folks. They're going to their rooms now. What I'll do, actually, I'm gonna move. To room 2. Oh, the other group not come back. Let's see. Okay, 45 seconds. Got it. And Jerry, where are you located? You're in. Cool. Cool, cool, cool. Is it getting super cold there already?
Jerry, can you send me some information? I have,
Hope you guys had some good just dialogue, and thank you, Hannah, for being jumping around and getting some insights. I'm gonna go back on mute again and turn it back over to
Thank you. No, thank you for moving me around. That was great. I enjoyed that. Let's see. Can you see my screen? You can't? Okay, let me do this again. Okay, here we go. Now you can see my screen. Okay, awesome. All right. So yeah, I hope it was helpful to kind of take a minute to talk about some of those and just kind of keep front and center some of the clients that you work with who kind of presented with those, because those are some of the themes that you would start to see emerge in a sand tray therapy session. And so I wanted you to kind of bring that to force, to center. So let's talk about sand tray therapy. So sand tray therapy is an expressive and projective mode of psychotherapy involving the unfolding and processing of and it's a processing of intra and interpersonal issues through the use of specific sand tray materials. Okay. And it's a very non-verbal, oops, sorry, here. It's a very non-verbal medium of communication. You can do this whole sand tray without speaking a word, right? But it could be incredibly powerful for the client, right? So understanding that the expressive modality, and because it's an expressive and projective modality, right, it allows material to come forward without being intrusive, right? So we're not having to ask questions, we're not having to um, you know, pry, we're not having to move them in a certain direction, right? But because it's projective and it's expressive, it's going to be at their own pace. It's going to unfold at its own pace, right? And it allows this exploration, right, of this some inner feelings, inner patterns, again, that intersect with the external world, and that comes out beautifully in the sand tray. And so humanistic sand tray is kind of, so there's humanistic psychotherapy, there's that, that's based on Carl Rogers' work, and there's person-centered work, and there's child-centered work. And so I certainly identify as a very child-centered therapist, and when I do play therapy, very much humanistic when I do sand tray therapy, and also with the adults that I work with. There are other, just to put it out there, there are other schools of thought with sand tray as well. I just don't work with that theoretical model. I work with the humanistic model. So if you're interested, you can always explore the other models as well. So sand tray is a type of play therapy, like I said earlier. It involves fantasy. There's symbolic expression, and there's a nonverbal element. So if you've done play therapy, or if you've observed a play therapy session or read about it, let's say in grad school, or you've done it yourself, you'll see that there's all these elements are there in play therapy, and that's what we see in sand tray therapy. So here's a little bit of research that I tried to plug into the, to the presentation, to kind of talk a little bit about the neuroscience and just the research around sand tray therapy. So research has found that sand tray can be very effective. Sorry, I'm getting a little obstruction here. Okay. Sand tray therapy can be very effective in helping children who've experienced sexual assault revisit those traumatic memories, take control of them. It allows them to reintegrate and create that narrative in a very healthy way. Kids can express themselves more while also minimizing that psychological distress, because again, it's an experiential method. Another study found that 18-hour long sessions of sand play therapy over 9 weeks, adults who had generalized anxiety disorder saw that their symptoms, decreased. And then there was another overview year evaluated 33 studies, and they found significant improvements in kids and adults, especially those who are experiencing any kind of traumatic stress. So we know there's a lot of research that backs up this work in sand trade therapy. Working in the sand invites the implicit world. When we talked about how implicit memories don't have words, right? So the implicit world, it invites that implicit world, which is the home of our earliest attachment wounds, right? We don't have words for, and it takes symbolic form, right? Exploration of the sand and the miniatures or the images, right? All of that brings to the forefront, right? A lot of those beliefs that we've held about ourselves that were relationally planted. And think about all the beliefs that are relationally implanted when we work, with our adoptees, adopted parents, or the birth parents. So when we think about talk therapy versus sand trade therapy, again, it can be used, sand trade therapy is used with all age groups. I've used them with the older kids. When it comes to the younger kids, so in my play therapy room, we have a sand trade box. So it's a little different. We're still doing play therapy there. But with the adults and the teens and the older kids in our sand trade room, it's a little bit more structured, a little bit different. And so it's very therapeutic without using words. You don't necessarily have to use words, just like how in play therapy, there's a lot of play happening. You're not necessarily using a lot of words to understand their inner world. There's a lot of metaphor creation in sand trade. Metaphor is just phenomenal because it's amazing in sand trade how clients will almost like create their own metaphors, and not just one, many. Like they'll sometimes like a cluster of metaphors that they'll create, and it's really, really cool how those metaphors create this new reality, right? This new coherent narrative for the clients. And they're doing it, they're creating it. And so it's just really fascinating to watch them do that. Based on the different sand tray materials that you have, like, let's say you have like a treasure box, you might have like a big treasure box, a small treasure box, one that opens and closes, one that static. And so having a variety can also help clients pick kind of which one, and it's interesting which of those they'll pick, right? And so there's just great opportunities for metaphors to come through. And then we talked about how it's expressive and projective. So just a little bit about the humanistic piece. So coming from, Carl Rogers and the child-centered, person-centered model, we believe that clients are capable of self-awareness. There's this inherent capacity for growth. People are always striving, right, for growth. They have the inner resources. And my job as a therapist, right, as a humanistic sand trade therapist or as a person-centered therapist, is to create this optimal environment for growth. And the most important or the most powerful way of doing that is my relationship with the client. The change lies in that relationship. What kind of a relationship do I have that's creating optimal growth for this client? So the goal is not to change the client. The goal is not to make a client a different person. The goal is self-awareness. The goal is creating this relationship so that it can be optimal for growth and awareness. And we believe everyone has the ability to do that. There's also an emphasis on the here and now. So for example, if a client's processing a tray or is having a moment while they're putting their tray together, we will, we'll stay with the here and now. We'll talk about what's coming up for them in the moment. We'll talk about what they're experiencing while they're building the sand tray. We're paying attention to those nonverbals. We're describing and noticing things. We are not interpreting things. There's no interpretation that's happening in the sand tray. There's more of that noticing, describing, reflecting, but there isn't like interpreting what something means. The meaning making of all the elements or symbols in the sand tray is the clients. They're doing that. They're making the meaning, and my job is just to explore what meaning they have made with this. So who is it for? Adults, couples, teens, families, typically for kids that are 9 and older. For the younger ones, a sand tray with the sand box in the play therapy room is ideal. But I've seen this play out with adults, right? Couples. So we'll have, I don't work with couples, but I've seen other therapists where they'll give each partner a sand tray and they'll build a scene in the sand tray or a world in the sand tray. And then there's processing that can be done about that. So what does a typical day look like for you and for you? And then we look at the trays and we understand how different this tray looks than this, or how similar this tray looks, or what are some similar elements that are present, or what are elements in one tray and not in the other, right? So it really helps. And same thing with families as well, where each in our office, we actually have smaller trays. They're these round, I don't know which, yeah, well, we have two different kinds, but we have like these smaller trays that can sit in your lap. And then we have a really large tray as well. So the large one is static, it stays in the room, and the smaller ones are kind of portable. You can take them around the office. So whenever we do something larger, like I've done sand tray therapy trainings, each of the therapists will have a tray. And so and I should add in here, who is sand tray therapy for? I've incorporated this in supervision. So I supervise associates who are seeking LPC licensure, and then also ones who are seeking the RPT. And so we incorporate sand tray in supervision, and it's phenomenal. It just, again, brings to the forefront things that your traditional talk therapy doesn't. And so I've had some great experiences with it. And so also great if you have associates, interns that you supervise. This is a great modality to use with them. And if you want additional training in that, definitely reach out to me. That's something that I'm putting together in my 2025 trainings, is to be able to incorporate or have a training for supervisors and how we can incorporate this into supervision. So this is just a great modality for that as well. So why sand tray? So let's talk a little bit more when we, think about why sand tray and why, with the adoption triad. Again, there's safety in metaphor, right? New metaphors have the power to create new reality. Think about the narratives that our clients have and how sometimes it, like, that status quo, right? Like how that distance from what I am feeling really authentically about this versus status quo. There's a gap there, and there's a distance there. But a lot of times in metaphor that feels safer because it's further removed from us, right? And then creating these metaphors or new metaphors has the power of creating this new reality, this more coherent narrative, this narrative that feels more authentic, right? And like I said, they create clusters of that. We don't want to interpret them, we want to explore them. There's distance. And it's very kinesthetic. It's using your senses in a different way. There's visual and there's touch, and that kinesthetic ability is so helpful in being able to bring again that implicit part of us, right? It allows it creates opportunities for the client to experience some kind of control and safety. So it's very, even visually, a sand tray has like boundaries, right? And so it helps contain the feeling, the experience, the scene, right? And so it's metaphorically, it helps contain it as well. Creating worlds in the sand allows clients a contained space for exploring those locked away parts of the self while coming into contact, a capacity for trust in self and others. And we know how that relational piece of trust of self and others plays out, right? And again, working in the sand invites that implicit world, home of our earliest attachment wounds that we don't have words for. Sand tray therapy is also a trauma-informed modality. The National Center for Trauma-Informed Care defines trauma-informed work as one where there is a basic understanding of how trauma affects the life of a person seeking services, right? And so this part is really emphasized in that sand tray therapy, where we are being very privy, very careful in understanding this, and we're not asking for clients to share their narratives. We're not asking for details. that this process is encouraging them to go there as and when they're ready and follow their own pace that feels right to them, which is a huge piece of trauma-informed care. So let's talk real quick about grief. Armstrong, who is what's his full name? I'm blanking. Stephen Armstrong. He was a professor here in Texas, and he died actually a few years ago. I trained with him, and he was phenomenal. And he mentioned in his book too, Sanctuary is the perfect intervention and expressive art modality for working with grief. Because of that kinesthetic quality of Sanctuary, it provides clients with a powerful nonverbal means of experiencing that grief. And then he also talks about polarities in the Sanctuary, which is an advanced concept where you understand, or you kind of look, in the Sanctuary, you'll see polarities, and also in the client building the Sanctuary, where it's like, I need to process the grief, but I'm afraid to experience the grief. And so you'll see this, like, I need that search and reunion is important to me, and it's in the back of my mind, but there is guilt, and there is shame, or maybe there is sadness, or there's a fear of all of that that's keeping me from it. So there are these polarities that cause this dissonance, and so it's so important to be mindful of that, of those polarities. And it's a little bit of an advanced concept that was in his advanced training as well. And so I just say this to say that that's something you want to pay attention to, even in talk therapy. What are the polarities? But in Sanctuary, you'll see it kind of play out as well in the scene. And then I'm just going to take a look at the time real quick. I know I see here. Okay, I'm just going to let's see. I'm just going to move right into Sanctuary equipment so that you can get a sense of what that looks like before we wrap up today. Okay, and then we'll have enough time for Q&A. Okay, the Sanctuary. Typically, it's your 30 by 20 by 3, and I'll show you a picture of it in a second. Blue inside. I keep mine's made of wood, and so I keep it dry, but some people have like a plastic one where they could put water in it as well. And so some people like to have a spray bottle to add a little bit of water to create some texture, or a little bit more. That's completely a preference. And then you can get different sand trays of different shapes and sizes as well. So this is the one that I have in my office. So it's, your typical rectangular, and there's a lot more sand in mine than this one, but very similar to what the walls look like and the base looks like, with the intention, with the intention to create like an experience, like a water body or the sky on the sides. All right, and then the sand. So there's lots of different kinds of sand out there. I really like the Sandtastic Play Sand. It's very smooth, fine. But there's also this moon sand that people love. It's like a darker sand, and that's been really popular. And then there's kinetic sand. Kinetic sand is really more, I think I used to have a traveling play therapy kit, and I would take that with me in a box versus the loose sand, like the regular sand that you might get at Home Depot. That's in my play therapy room. But when I had like that play kit that I would take, have, for in-home play therapy that we did through an organization, kinetic sand was just easier to carry and just something that was better, that we could manage better. So, but it's great. It's still that kinesthetic piece to it. So that's really great. And then you have your miniatures, and this is just these are the suggested categories of miniatures that you want to include. So people, animals, and having different, like a little bit of a variety is really good. But you want to have the people, the animals, the vegetation, the natural objects, buildings, structures, transportation, some fantasy, some spiritual, magical things, some landscape, environment, household items, miscellaneous objects. Now, think again from the adoption perspective, like what are some items that would be really important for you know, some of the clients that you work with, right? So maybe in the people category, you have several different ages, right? So in mine, I have like several babies, I'll have several mom figures, several dad figures. So you want to have that variety based on your clientele, right? Um, and then I'd once seen like a couple of pregnant figures, right? So just finding the right kinds of miniatures that you know would align with the work that you do. And then in terms of the spiritual piece, again, based on the clientele, these are those elements can be very, very powerful. So, and then one more thing I want to mention that it's not on here, but when you work with trauma and grief, you want to have containers. Those are really important because it's amazing what kids or people will do with containers, all kinds of containers. You know, and containers that open and close, containers that are see-through, containers that are you know, lock, like, you know, ones that have some sort of a lock or closed latch. Right. There's a lot of different things people will do with containers in the play therapy room. I'll see that with like, we have a mailbox looking thing. And so the things that kids will put in the mailbox, or we have another toolbox and the things that kids will use that and put other things in there. And so containers are great. Again, metaphorically, what are kids, people, teens, adults, adoptees, anyone from the adoption triad trying to contain, trying to put away, trying to hide, trying to not see, or don't want others to see, right? So definitely have some different sizes, types of containers is going to be really, really great. Okay, let's see. I'm just gonna this. Okay, all right. How to introduce a sanitary experience to a client. So this is a simple way of saying this. So I'll say, look at this tray, stand in it. I'll put my hand in that just to kind of show. You can move it, pilot. You can let the blue bottom show. You can demonstrate that. You can use the water if you have a spray bottle. You can choose to use the water bottle, the spray bottle if you'd like. You know, try placing your hand and see what that's like for you. And a lot of times, I'll be honest, the whole session will be them just kind of moving their hands through the session, through the sand. And we may not get to the miniatures, and that's okay. But that itself is very cathartic, just very soothing to be able to run their hands through the sand. Now, when we give them a prompt, right? And there's lots of different kinds of ways we can do this when we do the prompts. Actually, I'll come back to this slide here in a second. I want to share something else before that. This is how I'll share the miniatures that are there. Now, miniatures, people ask me a lot, how many should I get? Should I get, like, what is the golden number? And there's no golden number. What I'll tell clients, you know, therapists is, don't have so many in your room that it's overwhelming. So I've seen rooms where they have miniature like there's shelves and the miniatures are like from ceiling, like floor to ceiling, you know, wall to wall, and that's just too much, too many. You want to keep it really manageable for you and also not overwhelming for the client. So having them labeled in certain sections is great. Having maybe one wall of your office, and I, you know, typically offices are what, 10 by 10, 12 by 12, something like that. So just one wall that has shelves, and that's enough. I've seen ones that are just really crowded and really too much, and that's very overwhelming. So here's a collection of figurines, point to them, use many or as few as you like, take a few minutes to look around, select a few that really speak to you, place them in the sand, and feel free to add, you know, as many as you'd like, and create a scene or a world in the sand. Take your time and let me know when you're done. And that's a good way to give them some direction, but also leaving it pretty open, right? Here are some sand tray prompts. Now, again, you want to think about the client you're working with, the population you work with, so whether which you know, triad, you know, member of the triad that you're working with, and what are the current issues that we're working on right now, right? So sometimes a good starting prompt is like, create a scene of what your life looks like right now, right? And it can be anything. People are like, I don't know what to do. Like, you can do whatever comes to you, whatever comes to your mind. There's no right or wrong way of doing this. And when people get really hung up on the right or wrong, like, wait, am I supposed to do this? I mean, like, you know, and if it's really like getting to them, it's again very telling to me to conceptualize like how much, you know, how how hard it is to be free flowing here, right? So some of the things, make us, create a scene of what your family looks like. What's a typical day at home? These are just some general ones, but again, you want to think about what this would look like for the families, for the individuals that you work with. When the client's creating the scene, we don't want to walk away. We don't want to check out. We want to stay present because, Stephen Armstrong talks about this. The processing begins when the client begins to create the trick. So it's not like, oh, I'm just going to wait for them to be done and then the processing begins. No, this is all part of the process. The client, you want to watch how the client's creating the scene as well. Which figurine did they put first? Did they move things around? Did they put everything at once and then kind of, it'll tell you a lot about how they process information, how they create things, right? So it's a really important thing to observe when you're working with clients. You don't want to rush the client. You want to notice their nonverbals, notice the figurines they're choosing. Sometimes they'll hold the figure in their hand for a while, but then they'll put it back and not ever include it in the tray. There was something about that that was that they were kind of tugging with, but then they chose to put it back. You could play soft music in the background if you want. I don't do that. You certainly don't want to leave the room because the processing starts during that scene creation. Okay. All right, after the scene is created, how do we process it? A lot of times they'll say something like, tell me about your scene, tell me about what you created. Now, when this is the slide I skipped earlier, when you give a prompt, you always want to remember one thing, it's probably the most important things. You have no expectation from this tray. So what that means is that for the invitation to create a scene is truly an invitation, when there is no attachment to the outcome, right, of that tray. You should have no attachment or expectation of what the outcome is going to be, right? That's because if it's truly an invitation, it's going to be anything that the client wants to put out there. And like, oh, I wish the client really does this, or I wish she processes this. We want to have no such expectation. We want to keep it really open, right? So a lot of times therapists will get hung up on, well, I didn't see much in the tray, but what were we expecting, right? So we want to not have certain expectations from the outcome of the tray. That's very, very important. Okay, you don't want to touch any object in the client's sand tray unless the client asks you to. Don't want to clean up the sand tray while the client's still in the room. I always allow the client to leave the session, and then I take my time to put back all the items that the client, and there's a whole process to that I could, spend another hour talking about. We don't want to ask our client to clean up their sand tray, or we don't want them to change anything, like tell them to move something. We don't want to direct them in any way for that. While you're processing, notice any feelings. A lot of times clients will start tearing up as they process their sand tray or as they make their sand tray. And then you can ask them things like, what was it like creating this scene? So you really want to facilitate the process, that exploration, that awareness, the expression, so that they can really work through some of that implicit, those implicit memories, or just some of that's been really on the forefront or in the back that now is resurfacing. Okay, I'm going to pause here so I can take some questions because I know we're very close to being out of time. So I'm just going to go ahead and pause right there. Whoops. Okay. Okay, sorry, Stacy. I feel like I have always so much to cover and it always feels like there's not enough time. So I want to have a moment here for any questions.
One.
You just want to go ahead, Darcy.
Oh, thanks. I was just curious. I know you shared some like general prompts that you use. Have you found, or do you have any like preferred prompts that you like using with different members of the adoption constellation?
I always generate my prompt based on kind of what's coming up. The initial prompt is kind of that general one, right? Like create a scene of what your world looks like right now, right? And I like to say right now because it brings the focus to the here and now. Like what's happening today in our life that's really that's that's at the forefront. And that the expressive and projective mode of that work will help bring things that need to come up, but that's usually the starting one. And then I try to really generate them based on what's coming up for them, what issues, what I saw in my previous session with them, or some things that they've said that have been on their mind, but they don't have clarity around, or like if a child is, if an adoptee, let's say, is talking about that search and reunion, I might, encourage them to create a scene of what that search and reunion might look like for you. How do you envision that's going to unfold for you, right? And it might include elements of excitement and joy, or it might include some unsettled fear of like, will there be rejection again? I don't know what the search and reunion is going to look like. And then we process those polarities, we process what's coming up. So I encourage you to do the same when you think about prompts. You want to think about what's coming up for you and in the issues in the client, and then kind of generate those prompts from that. That's the best way to do it. There's a list of general prompts. Like if you go online, you'll find like a list of like Santry prompts that are kind of general, but I like to kind of, hone them into the work that we're doing with different members of the triad.
We have time for like 30 seconds for one more question for anybody else, or more importantly, Hannah, if you want to share your information, how people get a hold of you.
I'm going to put my email in the thing. If you have any questions that you feel like you haven't been able to get to, I'm just going to leave my email here and you can message me. Whoops.
You put your email in there. I'm going to say everybody, first and foremost, thank you. That was awesome. I learned so. I'm not a therapist at all. I'm an adoptive parent. So I don't know nothing in the background piece of it, but I thought you did a lot of great framing for different parts of the triad. And for that, I say thank you. Thank you for the people that attended today, no matter where you are. Triad, professional, it doesn't, I say constellation actually. That includes the I think therapists, and that includes the professional sides of our journey. So thank you all for attending. Please complete the session evaluation. I will put that back in here if I can remember. Yes, I'll put the session evaluation back in here. So please complete your evaluation if you don't mind. And if you are looking to do CEU credits, please complete the tracking sheet with the session title, and I will put that in there as well too. Sorry about that one. I'm going to do a quick view. I'll do a gallery view, and I can remember people's names, and I can just do a quick email for folks afterwards if I didn't put the title in there. But thank you all for your time today. This was wonderful, and I just want to say thank you, Heena, for this was great. This was great, and hope everyone enjoyed it as well too. So thank you.
And sorry we kind of ran short on time, but
Don't apologize. It's all good. Thank you all for everything, and hope you're enjoying the conference so far. We look forward to our next session, and great job. A lot of thank yous already. So great job, Hannah. Great job today. Awesome. Thanks everybody for joining. I'm going to close this room out and then get ready for the next room. All right. Have a great one. Bye-bye.